All right, hello everyone. My name is Shehzad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations at the New York City office, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for the DMARC webinar. In this webinar, we're basically going to just give you an introduction of what DMARC is, the benefits of implementation of DMARC, and a little brief guide in terms of the parts of DMARC and how it works. And then towards the end, we'll give you a little bit of a demo of how to use our setup guide just to kind of give you a starting point of creating the DMARC records that are needed and necessary. Again, as a side note, we are recording this webinar. If you do have any questions at any point during the webinar, feel free to use the questions box that's available to you on your control panel. Again, we'll do our best to answer those questions during the webinar. If we're not able to answer it during the webinar, we'll try our best towards the end or send you a separate email with an answer to your question. So please feel free to ask questions at any point in time during the webinar. So let's get started. So the first thing about DMARC is that we decided to go towards DMARC because of phishing. Phishing is a systemic global risk, and that's something that impacts anyone and everybody. So it doesn't matter who you are. It could be a home user, it could be a business, it could be a government, any size business, any type of private or public type organization. And as everyone on the call should know, is that when it comes to phishing, it leads to other types of attacks or other types of compromises. So it could lead to ransomware or other type of malware infections. It could lead to fraud. It could lead to theft of PII or PHI, depending on which sector you're in. So at some point in time, it's going to go somewhere. I mean, we're not going to give you stats or numbers, but in most cases, the leading cause of most compromises ends up being the wrong click on an email or the wrong click on a link. And it's just so successful because it's hard for most users to determine if that message is actually coming from a legitimate source, especially when the from and sender address is actually being spoofed. So that makes it even more difficult. So when it comes to phishers and spammers, they're getting a lot more craftier. Their spelling has gotten somewhat better in most cases, especially when they're targeted. They're very well written. In most cases, they end up being very urgent. So most users will just say, "Oh my God, it's coming from the CEO or the CFO or somebody at a C-level and executive level asking immediately to get some type of information." So this is where then senders will just basically just go with it and not even sometimes bother to actually look at what the actual email address is. They just look at the name or the title of the person that's sending that email. But when it comes to DMARC, our focus is really on the actual email address. So what DMARC is doing is it's a proven way to mitigate phishing by preventing a phisher from actually using a valid organization domain name. So it's pretty much like an identity check for your organization's domain. So DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. And in the webinar, we'll talk about each component. We'll talk about the authentication portion. We'll talk about the reporting capabilities and why it's really important to get those reports. And we'll talk about the conformance aspect as well. So what DMARC is you're creating a DNS policy. So you're using your existing DNS infrastructure. So you're not installing any type of software or in any type of tool necessarily when it comes to actually DMARC policy creation or DMARC policy implementation. You're just using your existing DNS infrastructure and creating a TXT record on your DNS server. And the purpose of the policy is to basically let all senders to indicate that their message is being protected by using different authentication standards and other policies. This way, the receiving side knows what to do if one of those authentication methods were to pass or fail. So either send the message to the junk or spam folder or completely drop the message and reject it. So in this way, now the sender is defining what happens with messages rather than worrying about what the recipient side is going to do with those messages. Because you don't really want the recipient to be the one dictating, well, okay, if it doesn't match this authentication, we're just going to completely drop it, especially if it is coming from a valid source or a valid location. Because they're not going to know. They're just going to go based on what they think is the way it should be. So you as the sender, the sending organization wants to be able to dictate what happens with any messages if the authentication message passes or fail. So now the key thing with DMARC is that it is a two-side process. So the sender has to create the policy. The receiving side has to have a DMARC verification set up on their end to make sure to check for these types of messages and what to do with these messages that are being protected using DMARC. So overall, what DMARC is going to do is prevent spammers or phishers from using valid organization names for email fraud. So that's one of the benefits of it, because now at this point, only valid systems or IP addresses should be sending mail. If they're not sending mail, or if they're not on your list, those are the ones that are going to get dropped or rejected. You have to update your list in order to allow those authorized systems. So in a way, it's also giving you an IT asset inventory. You have now, the IT staff or the email staff has now control over what email mechanisms are actually allowed to be used or unauthorized to use by the organization, rather than having your marketing or sales team deciding to go to use MailChimp or Constant Contact or use Salesforce to send mail on your organization's behalf. The IT staff, because they need to now, when this is implemented, those teams need to work with the IT staff and say, okay, this is what we want to use to send mail on our behalf. What do we need to do in order to make it valid? So now overall, what you're going to do is by implementing DMARC, you're increasing not only customer confidence and trust, but also your own staff's confidence and trust, and then protecting the integrity of your brand. Now, some other benefits of DMARC is the fact that there's already inbox protection out there on the consumer side. So people that are using Gmail or Yahoo or Outlook.com or Live.com, these people are already being protected by DMARC, because these organizations, these consumer inboxes, are using DMARC verification. Right? They may not have a DMARC policy. I know Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft themselves have it, but like Gmail and Yahoo.com, or Yahoo Mail and Microsoft.com, they're more set to their policy at none. That part doesn't matter, because it's for people sending mail. They're implementing DMARC verification. So organizations that have DMARC set up, they are being checked when those emails are going sent to any one of these consumer inboxes. So they're already participating on this. Now we need the businesses and the organizations to implement DMARC, so that way when it goes to the consumers, they know that they're getting valid emails and getting some form of valid emails. So I'm pretty sure the numbers in terms of 85% and 70% and the 2.5 billion are much higher than what was listed here. These are numbers from February 2016. More and more consumer inboxes are starting to do DMARC verification to protect their consumers. And then the other benefit of DMARC is visibility. DMARC will give you reports. You will get reports in which you can go and see what authentication mechanisms are passing or failing, what are the domains and IP addresses that are being used, if your domain is being used, who is using it, those types of information, then it will be found in there. So not only will it give you insight on the attempts to spam or phish or even spear phish, but also, again, it gives you an IT asset inventory. This way you know what are the other tools that your staff, your IT staff or email staff may not be aware of that are being used to send email on your behalf. So it gives you quite a lot of information, and that's why it's critical to get these reports and then do the analysis of these reports. So like I mentioned before, DMARC itself, it is free to use. I mean, there are some cost aspects to it in terms of the report analysis, and there might be some cost in terms of the staffing time in terms to do the implementation, but DMARC in itself is free to use because you're using your DNS server to create the policy. You're not purchasing that. You're not purchasing a tool. You're not purchasing anything in order to create the policy. But the caveat is that there will be some costs in other aspects, and we'll talk about those later. Now, in order to properly implement DMARC, one of the first things that you need to know about is these two other standards. These two standards are other authentication and authorization mechanisms for email. One most of you may be familiar with is a Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. So SPF is going to be basically your list of systems that are allowed or authorized to send mail on your organization's behalf. So this is where you're going to create another DNS policy to define this. And in here, just put in either the IP addresses or the domains of those authorized systems. So this needs to be placed. And the idea is that if it's not on the list, it should be rejected. You can use SPF by itself. It is perfectly well possible to do so. A good majority of people will already have it and are using SPF. The thing is with SPF is that even if you define things like hard fail or soft fail, the receiving side doesn't know what to do then. They know, okay, this message failed because it's not on the list, but what do we need to do with the message? Do we put it into quarantine? Do we drop it? Do we, bounce it back? What do we do with this message? So the recipient has to have an SPF verification enabled in order to do so. So if you do have SPF and somebody else is using it, you'll see that you can still send mail using other tools on behalf of your domain. So, I mean, SPF, yes, use it, but there are some, flaws to it. Then the other thing with SPF is if you're using a cloud service provider like Office 365 or Google, when you define your SPF policy, you're saying basically all Microsoft servers or all Google servers are allowed to send mail on your behalf. Well, there are other domains that are using it, those Google servers. So what's to prevent those domains from using your domain name to send mail? That's where something like DKIM can come into play. So domain keys identified mail. What DKIM is doing is adding a specific digital signature to authenticate your domain. So it's an additional layer of authentication that you're adding to your messages. Now, DKIM also can be used by itself. It does not have to be used with SPF or DMARC. It can be used on its own. And there's also nothing that says that DKIM, and if you have DKIM, check your SPF, or if you're using SPF, check for DKIM. There's nothing that dictates that. There's no SPF. There's no part of the SPF policy or the DKIM policy to say check for the one or the other. Other thing with DKIM is that there's also nothing that says what to do if the authentication fails. That's also, again, up to the recipient and for the recipient verification to be enabled. And then the recipient needs to decide what to do with that message. And that's a problem. And that's why DMARC comes into play, because DMARC now says to check for both SPF and for DKIM, and check to make sure they're both available, if they're both authorized and authenticated, when what to do with the message. And then you as the sender are now defining what to do with the message. The recipient is not going to have to do that, or there's no need for the recipient to do that. Now, what happens to those messages? So when you create your policy, your DMARC policy, you define what that's going to happen. And you have three different options: none, quarantine, and reject. So our recommendation is always start off with none. Because the reason to start off with none is because when you do this, nothing happens to any messages when you're sending them out. So meaning they're sent out as normal, like as if DMARC never existed. But the reason you start off with none is then you collect those reports that are being generated, that you receive from the receiving side. And from those reports, you can check, is SPF set up correctly? Do you have all the authorized servers listed in your SPF policy? Is DKIM working? Is everything set up there? Is everything being aligned correctly? If everything is set up correctly and don't seem to be any issues, that's when then you can move up your policy to either the quarantine or the reject level. So always start off at none. Now, because the reason is that if you go to quarantine, if your SPF and or DKIM checks fail and the alignment is off, your messages will get sent to your spam or junk folder. At reject, if the messages fail, SPF or DKIM checks, and the alignment is off, messages are dropped and not delivered at all. So that's the last thing you want to do, is to go jump all the way to reject, and now you have messages that are completely dropped because your SPF is not set up correctly, or your DKIM and alignment are not set up correctly. And there has been many cases of people doing that. People have jumped completely up to reject, and it created problems. They didn't know that there are other teams in their organization using third-party tools to send mail on their behalf. So the only way they knew it is because they were getting complaints. They're saying, well, our mails aren't going through, so things aren't being sent out. So they had to go back and review the reports, and after looking at the reports, they realized their errors. So they switched back to none, went through all the reports, adjusted their SPF settings, and adjusted DKIM, and making sure alignment for both SPF and DKIM were present. Once everything was done, then they went right back to reject. So this is why reports are very important, because those are the things that are going to tell you what to do and what things and adjustments that you need to make. So again, best practice, start off at none and gradually move up to reject. But reject has to be the end goal. It needs to be the end goal. So here's an overview. So again, like I said, there's two parts to this. There is the sending side that has to create the policy. Then there has to be the recipient side that has to do the DMARC verification. So when a person is drafting their email, they don't need to do anything. This is completely transparent to them. They're not going to check a button or put a check mark in to say, okay, enable DMARC or enable SPF or enable DKIM. The IT staff or whoever is responsible for the email or your DNS servers, they're the ones who have to publish the DMARC record, the SPF record, and the DKIM record in the organization's DNS server. So when the sender types up their email, they send the email. The sending org's email server is what's going to be responsible for adding the appropriate headers to that message before it gets sent out. Once it's sent out, the recipient side, again, if they do not have a DMARC verification enabled, the message just gets passed on as a valid email because there's nothing there to check. So it just passes on like normal. If they have DMARC verification enabled, that's where now the recipient email server is going to go back to the sending organization's DNS server to check what is the policy. Is it reject? Is it quarantine? Is it none? And again, depending on your policy levels, the appropriate action will be taken if the checks, either SPF or DKIM checks, pass or fail. So again, the recipient side does need to have a DMARC verification enabled. Now, many email gateways do have the DMARC verification process there. All you really have to do is, most cases, either put in a check mark for DMARC or just go to DMARC verification and turn it on. And then that will dictate on what happens to the policy. Now, the recipient side is also responsible for sending reports back to the sending organization. Those are the reports. So when you receive reports, you get it from the recipient side and not the sending side. So not all recipients necessarily will send reports back. A majority of the consumer ones will. So like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, AOL, Comcast, and so on. LinkedIn and some other organizations will send reports back to you and letting you know what's going on. And it's really up to the recipient's email server, the recipient side. What is the impact on messages? There's absolute minimal impact. In most cases, I have yet to hear any reports of implementing DMARC or DMARC verification having any impact or delaying messages from being sent or received. Now, here are two examples of what DNS records look like, the DMARC DNS records look like. So again, these are TXT records that you're creating in your DNS server. So it has to be the server that's your authorized server for your organization. So in the basic side, whether basic or complex, it always has to start with _DMARC. So _DMARC is the name of your record. So for example, for Global Cyber Alliance, it's _DMARC.globalcyberalliance.org. So it must start with _DMARC. If it does not, then it's not going to function. And you may have to work with your DNS provider because in some cases, some are still not accepting the underscore for some reason. If you work with them, they should be able to implement it for you so you can use the underscore with the _DMARC. The in.txt, that's just defining that it's a text record. So again, depending on your DNS server, the in.txt may or may not be required. However, the stuff in between the quotes is going to be your value of your DNS record. Then just to quickly go through this, so the way it works is the V equals is the version. So DMARC 1, it's only DMARC 1. There is no 2, 3, or 4. No reports of any other version coming out in any near future or long-term future. So it always starts off with V equals DMARC 1. It has to be in capitals. So the DMARC has to be capitalized. The next one, which is P equals, that is where you're defining your policy for your top-level domains and your subdomains. So P equals is for your subdomains and for your top-level domain. So this is where you can define what either put in P equals none, P equals quarantine, or P equals reject. Simple as that. You just type in the policy level that you want to use. Then after that is the RUA and RUF. That is your reporting capabilities. So there's two different types of reports. We'll talk about those two types of reports a little bit later on. But this is where you can define where you're going to send those reports to. So just note that you can only send reports to an address within your organization. You cannot send it to someone external by default. In order to do that, you have to take extra steps. If you're going to send it to someone outside of your organization, the receiving side has to set up another DNS record on their end to be able to accept reports from an outside organization. Now, the complex one is basically what we're doing is just adding some more of the default settings like FO, ADKIM. Those are not required. You can use them if you choose to, just to make them, just to change the settings a little bit. Really, the recommendation is try to leave them as at the default levels rather than adjusting them. In most cases, once you're more going towards reject, you may want to change a few, like the ADKIM and ASPF. Right now, the default for those are set to relaxed. So that means it's just be a little bit flexible in terms of the SPF, checking SPF and the DKIM side. You can set those to strict. So that means it has to adhere strictly to SPF and it adheres strictly to DKIM. By default, also the reports are sent every 24 hours. That's where the RI equals 86,400 seconds. So that's in seconds. It is by default 24 hours. You can adjust that to be either lower or higher. When you're starting off at none, I recommend either do 24 hours or less. Don't go any higher than that. And then the other one I want to talk about is the last one there, the SP equals, because you see now there's another policy level there. So SP equals quarantine. So in the complex, the last line at the end, the SP is now going to define just subdomains. So the P equals, if you have P equals by itself, it's going to find the policy for your top level domain and your sub-level domain. But they give you the option that in case you do have subdomains, that you may want to do something else in terms of defining a policy for your subdomains. So that's why there's the SP tag. So it's your subdomain policy. So why give that option when the P equals can do it? Well, what you may be happening is that there's two different options you can in terms of where you can use the SP, and there might be a little bit more, but these are the two that we know that we've seen most commonly. One is that if you know absolutely for a fact that you do not have any subdomains, okay, if you know for a fact you don't have any subdomains, you put in SP equals reject while the top level policy P equals is at none. So this way, while you're reviewing reports, you know that no one is going to attempt to use a subdomain version of your organization because you know you don't have any anyways. So you put in SP equals reject. This way now you're keeping that safe. So that way people can't use like sales.globalcyberalliance.org or hr.globalcyberalliance.org. You don't want, because we know those don't exist. So we put in SP equals reject. While at P equals none, this way now, while we're slowly, gradually moving up to reject, we can keep our subdomain safe. Or it could be the other way around, where when your top level domain, you're moving up to quarantine, but your sub level domains aren't quite ready yet. So you can put in P equals quarantine and then put in SP equals none. This way, then your people who are responsible for the subdomains, because in some cases the subdomains may have their own IT staff. They are now responsible for creating a DMARC policy on their end and for their subdomain, and then they can do what needs to be done on that side. So you can leave SP equals none while you're working with the top level domain and moving it up to quarantine. So there are two options that you have. If you're not sure, you can just stick with P equals none, look at the reports, and then the reports, it will let you know if there are subdomains that are being used. Because if those subdomains are being used, then you know what to do, or whether you need to just immediately put in SP equals reject, or you need to work with subdomains. So here's a list of some partners at GCA that are using DMARC. So there are various organizations. This list is actually much larger than what you're seeing here. It's actually quite larger than what you're seeing here. We just couldn't fit everyone's logo cleanly onto a single page. but just to give you some examples of organizations that are using DMARC at various levels. Now, when it comes to DMARC, like we mentioned before, there are two types of reports for DMARC. There's the aggregate report and the forensic report. The aggregate report is the one that you definitely want to have. The aggregate report is basically the one, if you look at the basic on the second line, the RUA. The RUA is your aggregate report. So, and then RUF will obviously be your forensic reports. The aggregate report is going to tell you everything about what's going on with all the messages that are being sent to the receiving side, to a receiving domain. So those reports that you get back will have the domains that are being used, the IP addresses that they're sending from, is DKIM settings, if DKIM is failing or passing, is it aligned or not aligned, what domain is used for the DKIM, and same for the SPF, is it passing or failing, is it aligned, what domain is being seen in the SPF policy. And this way then you know what's exactly going on. So it should be one full aggregate report. You should only get one report from each receiving server, but it's possible you may get 2 or 3 depending on how many messages you send. Now the forensic reports will have a little bit more detail. So typically the forensic report is actually one full message. So it'll actually spit back the message that and the details of that message in terms of who the sender is, who the recipient is, the message body, and so on. And that way you can see, okay, what's going on or what inside of that message could possibly have caused a failure, what kind of information is being taken or being asked for in those reports, in the forensic sides. Forensic reports you don't see too often. In fact, rumor has it that the forensic reports are eventually going to be deprecated because there's not too many that get sent out. And the reason for that is that a lot of organizations are afraid that if we send forensic reports and they typically come in clear text, that there might be PII or sensitive information in those reports. So, I know Google has stopped sending forensic reports. A few other organizations are considering it as well. So, it's not, if you don't get forensic reports, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But you may not see as many as you do with the aggregate reports. Now the aggregate reports are sent in an XML format. They're actually zipped files, and inside the zipped file is an XML document. And you can send it to any email of choice. So you can send it to multiple addresses if you choose to. All you have to do when you define the policy, you put in RUA equals mail to : the first email address, comma, mail to the second one, comma, and so on. Not recommended to send it to too many addresses. You should limit the number of addresses. In fact, if you can, send it to a group account rather than to a personal work account, because if you do get a lot of reports, you don't want your work email to get swamped with DMARC reports. So if you can send it to a generic account like DMARC at your organization name, that might be better, because that way it's a centralized view and then multiple people can review those reports. Now the number and length of the report is really dependent on the amount of email sent, so that will vary. You typically get one report from each receiving side, so you don't get a report per message, you get a report per receiving server. So if you send, say, 1,000 emails to Gmail users, you should get 1 or 2 reports back from Google. And like mentioned, report, and we keep stressing this, you'll see throughout so far in the presentation, we're basically talking about reports, and we're just trying to stress the criticality of actually getting those reports and reviewing those reports. Because again, those reports are going to give you the information that you need to determine which messages were marked as suspicious, which ones were failing, which ones were not failing. And then that way it gives you the IT staff the time to correct any issues. Do they need to update the SPF record because they're actually using an authorized mail server, just weren't aware of it? Or are these going to be your spammers and phishers? And even with those spammers, even if your reports, if your SPF and your DKIM settings are aligning and everything is working great, the reports can give you spammers and phishers. These are good cyber intel type information which you can use either to add to your anti-spam filters in case somebody was able to sneak, some other type of message was able to sneak through, and protect yourself and be able to kind of add and improve your defense capabilities in terms of the cybersecurity side. So it's important to get those reports. Now, reports in XML are not easy to read. I'm not sure if anyone on here has gotten reports. If you try to open them, the first time I looked at a DMARC report, I looked at the XML document thinking, okay, it shouldn't be too bad. It is. You can start, when you start off, you eventually start off looking at it and seeing it fine. But as you go further down, you start losing your place in terms of which one was the one passing, which one was the one that was failing, what was going on, and things like that. So it's not recommended to open up those zip files, open up the XML document and review it just by eyeballing it. So what options do you have? So there's two different types of options. One is you can use a DMARC service provider. So here are a few that are our partners. So Gardi, DMARC, ValleyMail, Proofpoint, on DMARC, Easy Solutions. All of them basically provide you with DMARC aggregate reporting backends. And some of them actually provide you with much more. Like some provide anti-spam, anti-phishing, or email fraud prevention, and so on. But in terms of DMARC, you can actually send them your DMARC reports, and what they will do is give you a nice portal view of those reports. This way you can see it in a nice clean view. And the other nice thing about this is that it actually gives you the aggregate for all of them for the entire day. So this way you're not looking at individual reports. If you have 100 reports that you get in a day, you send it to one of these providers, you'll see all 100 reports in one view instead of 100 individual reports. So there are some benefits of using the DMARC service providers, and I do recommend using one of these if you get a large number of reports, because it just makes it easier to see these and to be able to view those reports. And in many cases, some of these vendors will actually help you. They'll actually help you with the implementation process, help you with getting from none all the way up to reject, and help you in terms of rectifying and fixing issues as well when it comes to the SPF or DKIM settings. But of course, there's going to be a cost associated with it if you use any one of these vendors. But there are free options that are available to you as well. So here are a few of them. Just realize that by using free options, there are caveats to those free options. So for example, like you can use DMARCian's XML uploader, which is an XML to human converter. What this will basically do is you can take all of your zipped up reports, upload them to DMARCian's website, and it'll give back to you an HTML view of your reports. But it's not a full aggregate view, of all 100 reports. You get individual HTML reports. So if you have 100 reports that you upload, you'll get back 100 HTML versions of those reports. So that's the thing you have to take into account for when you're using something like this. So that's why it's, if you're going to use an XML to human converter, it's best used if you use a small number of reports that are being received. So not if you're using a large amount of reports. There are other DMARC analyzers out there, which, again, some of them will have limited capabilities. Like Postmark is actually another DMARC vendor. You can actually send them reports, and they can give you some other views as well. But they also have a free side in which they will basically, you can send the reports to them, and they'll give you a weekly report. So they'll give you a weekly overview of what's going on and things like that. There's also DMARCanalyzer.com. So DMARCanalyzer.com, they're located in the Netherlands, and they give you a nice portal view. They have also paid versions as well, because the free version is limited to on how many reports they can receive in a daily basis, and they only give you a historical view of 14 days. But they do give you a nice full aggregate report. Just again, note they are in the Netherlands, because I know for a US-based organization, data privacy concerns if it's outside of the US. There's also MX DualBox. I myself have not used it, but quite a large number of people do and are using it, and they have said good things about it. So that's another option that's also freely available. But then there are also third-party tools that you can use. And these third-party tools are good if you have your own internal infrastructure. So if you have your own Exchange server or SendMail server and so on, you can use these tools because they require some level of infrastructure in place in order to be able to get those messages and parse those reports. So LinkedIn's Lafayette, SendGrid, DMARC Parser, Yahoo DMARC's Report Parser are just a few of them. If you go to DMARC.org's code and library page, there's more that are on that as well. just take into account that these are written by third parties. Most of them aren't regularly updated, but most of the developers that are responsible for the creation of these tools are actually pretty good and responsive if you ask for help or guidance in terms of doing and installing these and implementing these tools. So those are your options in terms of, you can either use a DMARC server providers, again at a cost. I'd recommend it if you have a large number of reports, or you have various free options. Just realize that there are limitations in the capabilities of most of these. The third-party tools, again, you may need some guidance and some help in terms of doing the implementation and installation of those. So example of a success story. So Aetna is one of the organizations that has helped us and actually brought DMARC to our attention in terms of promoting it and putting it out there for other organizations to be aware of. And they actually implemented it in early 2015. They did take their time to do the implementation and move up from none to quarantine to reject, and making sure third parties that are working with them are actually sending the mail and forwarding mail appropriately and so on. So after their implementation, so each year they're seeing the DMARC program prevent approximately 60 million fraudulent email messages from being delivered. That's 60 million just for them from their end. And that's just by implementing DMARC. So like it says, the result is lower risk and better engagement. Click-through rates on Aetna's email improved by 10% every year. So at this point, adding that trust component has been very critical for them on their end. And other organizations, HMRC, which is Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs in the United Kingdom, for them, they stopped 300 million phishing emails that were using their email address, fraudulently using their email address. Granted, maybe most organizations might not be that high, like in 60 million or 300 million, but if you're a large organization, this is probably where you're going to see small, medium-sized businesses should still need to implement it. You might not be in the millions, but you could be in the thousands. Who knows? You might be in the millions, but you won't know until you actually have until you have DMARC capabilities implemented and you're taking a look at the reports and seeing whether your organization is actually being used. So, I mean, this is something that needs to be applied to every level, small, medium, large size organizations. Now, we've been talking about benefits and the pluses and pluses to it, but so let's talk about some of the concerns that we've heard of and then ones that we've seen. So one key thing is that this is not a silver bullet, all right? Because you still need to have anti-phishing and anti-spam tools in your organization, because you still need to protect yourself from other users. Because all DMARC is doing is preventing people from using your domain. It's not necessarily doing it from other domains who have not implemented DMARC. You should still have a DMARC verification tool enabled and on your end, but it's you still need to have those anti-phishing and anti-spamming, because if people use made-up domain names, those are still going to get through, even if you have DMARC verification in place. The other thing is it does not protect against variations of organizations' domain names. So meaning it doesn't, if you have a .net version, or sorry, if you own, say, .net, but then there's .org, there's .com, .biz, .tv, and so on, .bank, those aren't being protected by when you implement the .net version of your organization name. Now, if you own those other versions, then you can implement DMARC on those as well, regardless of whether you use them for email or not. You can create an empty SPF record, don't create a DKIM record, and then for DMARC, simply put in the policy of reject. And that's it. So now you're protecting those and preventing people from using it, but you have to own that domain in order to implement DMARC on that domain. So if you own a variation, implement it regardless of the fact of whether it's used for email or not. This way you can find out, are people trying to use it for email? The other thing is that doesn't protect against other types of variations. So say for Microsoft.com, if there's a 1 instead of an I or a 0 instead of an O in Microsoft, it's not going to protect against that unless, again, Microsoft owns that domain or that type of variation. Then they can implement DMARC for that. But if they don't, then yeah, it won't protect against those types of variations. Can email break? It could, but it's really only if implementation is done incorrectly. So like the example I gave before is people just jump to reject without reviewing reports. That's when things tend to break. So that's why we say, when we recommend, start at none first, review those reports, and who knows, within a day or two or maybe a week, you might be able to just jump right up to reject. Also make sure your syntax is correct. So when we're talking about the DNS, the DMARC TXT record, one thing I mentioned for the version, the DMARC, when V equals DMARC 1, make sure DMARC is in capital letters. Make sure you have those semicolons. Don't put in extra spaces. Those kinds of things can cause errors and cause problems. Obviously spelling errors. So it's almost like programming. So you have to make sure your syntax is correct. And our recommendation is to implement SPF and Beacon before DMARC. You don't have to do it that way. You can go ahead and put in DMARC now and put it in at the policy level of none. And then implement SPF and Beacon after. You can do that. It is possible. And the reason most people will do that is because they want to get the reports. And then when they get the reports, they look at the SPF portion of it and just update the SPF portion accordingly and appropriately. So you can do it. Just remember, though, do not go to quarantine or reject until your SPF and DKIM and your alignment are all put into place and put in correctly. Not enough resources. So implementing can be time consuming, and that is true, especially if there are multiple subdomains. So like mid-sized, large organizations that have multiple subdomains or might be global and IT shops across the nation or across the globe, that's where it might take time for them to do the implementation. But in most cases, if you know you're a small organization or a mid-sized organization, and you only have a single subdomain, it may only take you 24 hours or a week to go ahead and implement DMARC and put it at none. It takes more time just to get up to reject. But I mean, if you use a DMARC vendor, most of the vendors will say that they get you up and running to reject within a week or so. And I think in most cases, when it comes to resources, you need it more for the analysis side than the implementation. Because again, depending on how many emails you send, you could get hundreds of reports, you could get thousands of reports on a daily basis. So you need resources in order to review those. So DMARC vendors can help alleviate this, but again, it's going to be at a cost. If you have a NOC or a SOC, you may want to have the staff and those teams review those reports and be able to give them the capabilities of reviewing those reports. So that way you have staff that can do it, especially on a SOC side, so a security operations center, because again, for them it might it might be valuable information, because now they know who your spammers and phishers, and can take that type of cyber intelligence in a sense and be able to use that for other parts of the organizations to improve security and improve cybersecurity. Another issue is mailing lists and mail forwarders, because one thing is that people who forward mails, or when you're sending mail to a mailing list and then the mailing list passes it on to other people, it can break DMARC. It has broken DMARC. What needs to be done for those mailing lists or mail forwarders or intermediaries, they need to implement ARC, Authenticated Received Chain. It's a new standard that came out. It's actually been in development, but they now, as of March of this year, the developers for ARC have been encouraging people to implement this and start using it. Google and AOL have already implemented it and have been able to successfully pass on DMARC messages that are going out to mailing servers or to a large group of being forwarded to a large group of people. So it's important that anyone, if you have a mailing list for your own organization, or if you know anyone with mailing lists or mail forwarders, please let them know about ARC. If it's go to arc-spec.org. That's where there's more information on it. They can sign up there to get more additional information and guidance on terms of implementation. And there's tools available that they can use to do the implementation of this. So, so there is a solution. So these are some of the concerns that we've been made aware of. If anyone who's on the webinar is aware of any other ones, please let us know, and then that way we can either add them to the list and then see what the workaround or a solution to that is. But regardless of those concerns, I mean, the benefits really outweigh those concerns. Most of the concerns, there are workarounds to it. Granted, for one of them, there is some cost associated with it, but you want to make sure your brand is being protected. You want to make sure your consumers and your employees are being protected. And then you want to protect your organization by knowing who those spammers, phishers are that are using your domain name. So what can you do next? So the next thing obviously is going to be to go ahead and implement DMARC and implement it on your organization. So, but again, not only implement DMARC and implement the DMARC policy, but also make sure you have a DMARC verification in place as well. So that way you're protecting your own employees from people who are externally using DMARC within your organization. Now, from the GCA side, what we've done to hopefully make things a little bit easier is creating a setup guide. And the setup guide, and the purpose of the setup guide is to help you go through step by step to learn how to create these policies and what these policies and the DNS records will look like. So I'm just going to switch over here to Chrome just to give you a quick overview. We're not going to go spend too much time on this and review it, but just to give you an example of how it's being used. So if you go to dmarc.guide.globalcyberalliance.org, this is where you can start the process. And obviously the way you start this is by entering your domain. So it's important that when we're talking about domain, we're not talking about www. We're not talking about http://www. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about your actual email domain. So for example, say this is the email address. So we'll say smirza@example.com. Now we just want the domain. So we just remove everything from the @ and leave that portion. So everything that's after the @ symbol in your email address, that's what you're going to use here. Now, if you're using Google G Suite or if you're using Office 365, make sure you follow their directions when it comes to SPF and Beacon, because they do it in a different way and in a unique way. Google Apps and Office 365 actually give you the keys and the DKIM settings, so you need to follow their process and their procedures. Then you can always come back to our guide to set up the DMARC policy. So we're using example.com. I hit submit. I know they're using SPF. So this is where it basically gives you the results. So for right now, all we're doing is checking to see if you have the record or if you don't have the record. So in this case, example.com has SPF, but it looks like they don't have DKIM or DMARC. So, and that's all. So green check, obviously it exists. X, the red X, it does not exist. Now for DKIM, our checker is not 100% accurate when it comes to DKIM. The reason for it is because the DKIM record name can basically be anything. So it's hard to search for something that when you don't know what the actual name of the record is. And the name is what we call the selector portion of the DMARC name is what can be unique. So we do search for certain ones, which are listed here. If these exist, then it will change the DMARC to a green check. If it doesn't exist, we have options here to allow you to check. So one is that if you know the selector or the name of your DKIM record, you could put it in here. If you don't know the name, you can just put in your email address, hit submit. You get an email from dkim@globalcyberalliance.org. All you do is reply back to the message, and if a DKIM selector exists inside that message, then it'll switch this to a green check and give you the selector name. If it doesn't, then it gives you a red X. So that's basically what the results page does. Now, how do we go through to the tutorial? So say we want to go ahead and implement DMARC. So we're just going to skip straight to DMARC. So what you do is you select DMARC. Once it's highlighted, you just go down here and you can press next. And that will start the tutorial. So like I said, I'm just going to quickly go through this because I'm not going to repeat the entire presentation for you again. So it'll give you an explanation what DMARC is and what is going on with DMARC. You press next. Now you're going through and answering a series of questions like, what should the policy level be? Where should the aggregate reports be sent to? So like I said, a good place to send would be to a generic account. And what most people will actually do is may even take it further and just separate them out in the terms of type of report. So they can use dmarc-rua@example.com. And if you have multiples, you can just add those. If you need more than 3 boxes, just hit the plus symbol. Press next. Send it here, but we'll say RUF. So this is where the forensic reports are going to go to. You press next. What do you want your policy for your subdomain to be? So again, like I mentioned before, you need to determine what the level is. So if you set this to none, if you have multiple subdomains, so that we can set up separate DMARC policies for each subdomain until each of your subdomains are compliant with the DMARC policy, your top level policy. But if a subdomain does not exist, recommended to use reject. So I'm going to say for example.com, there is no reject. There's no subdomain, so we're going to go for reject. Now just make note, this is not going to implement DMARC for example.com. This is just going to give us what the record you can use when you want to implement DMARC. Press next. Then these are the remaining options, which are default. You can make the adjustments and changes to them as needed if you choose to. If you want to change the reporting interval, you have the option here. We have a calculator here to convert from hours to seconds. We're going to leave it to the default, so just click finish, and then now this is an example of what your DMARC record should look like. So now when you're implementing this, it's very important that you don't copy it and fully copy it and paste it, because not everything is necessary where you actually implement it in your DNS record. Some cases, all you might need is just the _DMARC, and all you need is the information in between the quotes. So it really depends on what your server is. So don't just copy the entire thing and just put it in as your value. This part is the name of your record. The items between the quote is the value that you would use for the text record. At that point, there you go. You have your DMARC TXT record. Now you need to just go ahead and implement it on your on your systems. And then the SPF and the DKIM are pretty much similar to this. You go through and answer the questions, and at the end you get your policy and what your policy would look like, and the policy that you would consider implementing. So that is our DMARC setup guide. Just as a side note, it is available in multiple languages. So it is available in French, Spanish, German, Japanese, and Chinese Mandarin. If anyone who's on the webinar now knows any one of these languages, if you want to go ahead and check those and make sure that our translation is accurate, then that'd be great. If there seems to be something off, please let us know. We would greatly appreciate it, because we have had people check Spanish and French and obviously English and make sure they are accurate. So some additional resources that are available to you. There's DMARC.org, obviously a great site for information, because those are the ones. DMARC.org is the group that created the policy for DMARC. They have a lot of information that's available to you. Obviously, GCA DMARC, so DMARC.globalcyberalliance.org. We have a lot of information there as well, a lot of resources, a lot of information that's available at the C level as well, to help out anyone who needs to explain this to their executives or to the CEO. We have videos on there as well, and other resources that you can download, like Slick Sheets and so on. We have a YouTube channel where the webinar will be posted as well. Videos for the GCA DMARC Setup Guide are available as well. And actually, as of today, we also released another video for how to implement SPF, DKIM, and DMARC using Office 365. So that's also now available on our YouTube channel, and also our website as well. So at this point, this is the end of the webinar. I'm here and open for any questions that anyone has. Again, if you do have questions, you have the questions control panel, questions box available into your control panel. Just type your question in there and send it off, and I will answer those questions as needed. If you're unable to use the questions box, feel free to send me an email. My email address is right there on the screen. I'll take a look at the email and see if I can answer your question that way. Can you explain? So we have one question here. Can you explain why the RUF, forensic report, is a bad practice, please? So I'm not going to say it's necessarily a bad practice. It's that people are not using it because of the fact that there is a chance of PII type information being sent in those forensic reports. So there might be sensitive information, because the way those report, when it comes to a forensic report, it's not actually really technically a report. It's actually the email message that was sent that was either failing or failed a policy or being spoofed, or being bounced for some reason. This is why most people will do that. So the sensitive information is the actual message body. So in the message body, if somebody has, for example, it's an invoice, they could potentially have credit card information in it. It could potentially, if it's in the health sector, it could potentially have social security numbers or other types of information. That's why most people are afraid of the RUFs, the forensic reports, and there's more concerns there. So that's why a lot of people are more shy for it. Honestly, on my side, the only types of forensic reports that I've seen is out of office messages. There's one occasion for one organization where I did see an invoice. So that's a problem, and that's why the forensic reports. And yes, you're right, it could be a HIPAA violation at that point, because if there is PHI type information in that, so public health information or private health information in that email message, it's a problem. Because you don't want, especially if you're sending these reports to the vendor, you don't want the vendor getting these types of reports. So that's why, I mean, I don't know when it will be deprecated, but the rumor has it that the RUF will be deprecated. If it does, we'll obviously set up a blog and create a blog releasing information that this is no longer being used, so you can remove the RUF. So how do you set up a DMARC report without the RUF report? All you have to do is just don't put an RUF. So if I go back here to this, so where you see in the basic or even the complex, the second line, so instead of using, so basically just don't put an RUF equals. Just leave that line out and you will not get any forensic reports. No, it's not required. If you, I mean, yes, during the setup process, if you just leave it blank, it won't put it in. It's not necessarily required. We just put it in because we just suggest getting it just for your own sake. But at some point in time, we're going to change that to basically and move it to the optional aspect of it. But if you don't, and during the setup, just leave those fields blank, and then the RUF won't appear at the end. So I also want to sign out because I see a few people are still on here. There's two email addresses you should see on your screen. So GCA-DMARC@globalcyberalliance.org or my email address smears@globalcyberalliance.org. Here at GCA, we're willing to help you with the implementation process if time allows. We don't do reporting analysis or report aggregate viewing. We can help you get started with it, but we won't collect reports, and we don't do that reporting part of it. We can help you with some of the free tools just to give you an example of what kind of information is there and what to look for. If you need just a starting point in terms of help for the implementation process, we'd be more than happy to do so. We are currently helping other organizations. We're helping a large city. We've helped a hospital. And we've helped some small businesses as well in terms of implementing DMARC. So if you have any questions at any point in time, send us an email and we can help you with the process. Otherwise, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining the webinar. If you would like a copy of the presentation or if you would like a copy of the webinar recording, please let us know and we can send those off to you.